This is an EQ in bog standard default mode, and this is the same EQ in linear phase mode. Just like this is a linear phase EQ, and this one isn't. Is there any difference? Does it sound any different? And does it even matter? Let's find out. First things first, a huge thank you to Jamie for doing a lot of the research into the deep technical aspects for this video. Anyone who spent more than a few days in music production knows what an EQ is. You turn certain frequencies or frequency bands up and down to tweak the overall tonality of a sound source. But there's something about digital EQ that not many beginner or amateur engineers know. EQ is made of delay. Yeah, delay. It sounds a bit crazy, but knowing how this can affect your work is an absolute game changer, and mastering this knowledge can lead to cleaner and more professional sounding productions. Let's start off with the big questions. What is digital EQ? How does it work? And why is it different from analog EQ? Without going too deep into electronics theory, analog EQ works using capacitors and inductors. These components shift the phase of the AC electrical signals passing through them, and the resulting phase-induced attenuation of certain frequencies achieves the desired effect by combining the phase-shifted signal with the original unaltered signal. The degree of phase offset caused by the circuitry will determine which frequencies will be attenuated or boosted due to coinciding troughs and peaks of signal waves. This essentially uses an analog form of delay, in the form of the electrical latency induced by the components, to offset the phase of the signal. And before we move on to the digital world, here's a quick message from our sponsor, Flopcat. In the digital world, EQ functions somewhat along the same logic, but instead of circuitry, using a digital delay line. Again, without trying to explain the entirety of computer science, here's a brief explanation. Let's imagine the sample rate of our project is 48 kHz. The first value, the first sample of audio, stored as a number, is placed at address 0 in the sample buffer of the EQ plugin. Then, when the next sample is measured, 1/48,000th of a second later, that first number moves to address 1, and the new number moves into the now empty address 0. Repeat this 48,000 times per second, and you have a constantly shifting line of numbers slowly moving its way through the process. To create an equalizer, we have to take one of those values from an intermediary memory address, let's say sample 52, and feed it back into the input at a slightly reduced gain level. To make this easier to comprehend, we're going to pretend the amplitude of a sine wave passing through our plugin goes from -10 to +10 in whole numbers. Now, the number in address 0, the most recent sample the plugin has just received, is combined with sample 52 we just took from further down the chain, and a phase shift is created through combining the two numbers into one new value. That is our new EQ'd value, an addition or subtraction of the gain of that particular sample. Repeat this 48,000 times per second, and the overall tone of the audio you're hearing changes based on the values that are added together. The resulting phase shift volume change for each sample from the numbers being used in these calculations will determine the resulting tonality of our EQ. And of course, we also need to take into account the fact that normal delay has an inherent phase shift across all frequencies by a different amount. For example, 54 samples of delay is not very many degrees of rotation at 2 Hz, but amounts to many cycles at 18,000 Hz. Using this newfound logic, knowing that a phase shift is created when we use a standard digital EQ, the technical term for which is minimum phase EQ, we can now determine that using an EQ on a mix will have an effect on the overall phase of your mix. The more EQs you use, and the more harshly the Q shape of each of those EQ moves is pushed, the worse this effect will get. This is called phase smear, the combined phase discrepancies created by the changing latency of various frequencies. Sometimes you may not hear the effects of phase smear, it may be too low in significance to be detectable. But when you can hear it, it can sometimes be undesirable for your production. But of course, there's a space for everything, and I wouldn't doubt for a moment that someone's taken this effect to the max and used it as a cool creative tool. This brings us onto linear phase EQ. In the analog world, phase smear caused by the circuitry-induced latency we discussed earlier was something that circuit designers tried to minimize, or alternatively turn into something that sounded pleasing. In the digital realm, plugin developers can achieve what is technically impossible in the analog world: Linear phase EQ is equalization that still changes the phase response, but it only changes the phase response as a linear function of frequency. The phase of the process is entirely linear. When a signal passes through the filter of the EQ, all frequencies should experience the same time delay, also known as pure time delay, which preserves the original audio wave as much as possible. All filters have phase shift, that's a fact. However, it's possible to design a filter so the phase shift is linear with respect to frequency, which then becomes a pure time delay, and this doesn't colour the sound of the original audio. Phase smearing is no longer a factor when using linear phase EQ. You can achieve a cleaner result when using linear phase EQ because of this. Linear phase EQ is also said to sound more analog than minimum phase EQ. However, although linear phase EQ eliminates certain issues, it does create other issues. Pre-ringing is a negative artifact commonly associated with using linear phase EQ. To explain this, imagine the transient on a snare drum. The audio in the transient comes in almost immediately as an impact. When pre-ringing comes into effect, there's a short crescendo in the waveform before the main transient information appears. This can affect the overall tonality of transients and can sometimes sound a little unpleasant. This is why it's a good idea to use linear phase EQ in moderation. Of course, it's all horses for courses. It depends on your music as to which EQ will suit your situation the best. Some engineers will say never to use linear phase EQ, some will use it on every project. One situation when you may want to benefit from linear phase EQ is when treating multi-mic'd audio sources. Let's take a drum kit for example. The mic on the snare drum picks up the snare sound, but also picks up the sound with varying degree based on mic choice from the kick drum and toms. The conflicting audio waves entering the mic at different latencies due to the time required to travel from the source to the microphone causes phase discrepancies. If we use a minimum phase EQ, or standard EQ, to tweak the tonality of one microphone with all of these colliding sound waves already causing phase, then the standard EQ is only going to add to that effect due to the latency induced by the feedback loops on which they operate, as I covered earlier. If the engineer decides to use a linear phase EQ, then the pre-existing phase discrepancies caused by multiple sound waves entering that single microphone aren't going to be exacerbated. They will be preserved in their current form due to the linear phase response of the perfectly preserved waveform when passing through a linear phase EQ. But what's that? We can still hear some phase, or something horrible at least, going on in our recording. When you record a multi-source instrument such as a drum kit, and the sound waves are all colliding and reacting to each other, comb filtering comes into play. The various boosts and nulls of certain frequencies will be impossible to avoid, it's physics. When we tweak the tonality of a drum recording, whether it's the overall drum kit tone on a mix bus or on a per mic basis, we're still going to hear some negative phase effects going on. The volume and presence of the comb filtering caused by our multi-sound source instrument will be raised or lowered depending on how you use your EQ, and there's no way around it. You have to choose carefully between adding more phase shift into your mix but preserving the transients when using a minimum phase or standard EQ, or doing the opposite with a linear phase EQ, keeping the phase in its best possible form, not exaggerating the already comb filtered audio, but slightly affecting the transient information. This is all very complicated stuff, and the only way to truly understand it all is of course to practice. In reality, you're probably not going to hear a huge difference in your mixes, regardless of which type of EQ you choose to use. Just so we know what we're working with here, here's a few examples of plugins and hardware which operate on minimum phase EQ logic. Soundtoys SI-EQ, Neve 8803, FabFilter Pro Q3. And a few examples of linear phase EQ plugins. FabFilter Pro Q3, IK Multimedia T-Rax Linear Phase EQ, Waves Linear Phase EQ, Vox & Go Marvel GEQ, and Blue Cat Linear EQ. You might have noticed that FabFilter's Pro Q3 appears in both these lists. That's because it can do both. On this drop-down, we can choose between zero latency, which is akin to using a hardware EQ, which we now know is a minimum phase EQ, natural phase, which not only matches the magnitude response of analog EQ, but also matches the phase response, or linear phase EQ, which only tweaks the magnitude of the audio. To make all this a little easier to understand, let's hear some samples, but not before another message from our sponsor, the Floppatron 3000.
This episode is brought to you by Floppcat. Floppcat. This episode is brought to you by Floppcat. Floppcat.
These are all very minuscule differences, and if you can't hear the difference, then you're probably not alone. It's incredibly subtle, and it will take lots of practice to be able to tell with any deal of accuracy which is which on a blind test. Although it definitely is possible, if you spend enough time learning these intricate details, to be able to know which will suit your music better. Remember, this knowledge is all great to have, but if your music sucks, no one's going to listen to it anyway. So make sure your music is awesome before anything else, and don't get too sucked into the deep wormhole of worrying about complex audio engineering knowledge such as this, especially if you're a beginner. It can get really overpowering really quickly. Master what you know before moving on to more complex things. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, then please hit that beautiful red subscribe button, ding the ding dong, and you will see us in the next video.
This episode is brought to you by Floppcat. Floppcat. This episode is brought to you by Floppcat. Floppcat.